The wind did not just blow across the Wyoming Territory in the late 1870s. It scoured. It carried the grit of 3 territories, picking up speed across the flat, hard-pan floor of the basin until it hit the foothills with the force of a physical blow. It carved dust devils that danced like angry spirits across the brown grass, twisting and dying in moments of violent breath. To the west, the mountains rose up like blue ghosts, jagged and indifferent, their peaks already dusted with the white warning of the coming season. Eli Carter stood in the shadow of those mountains, fighting a losing battle with a section of barbed wire. He was a man built of the same hard angles as the land he worked. In his early 30s, he moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long days and little rest. He wore a coat of heavy canvas that had once been the color of wheat but was now stained with oil and earth, and his hat was pulled low to shield his eyes from the biting grit. He leaned his weight against the cedar post, wrestling the wire taut with leather-gloved hands. The metal sang a high, tight note as the wind vibrated against it. Eli twisted the pliers, locking the barb in place, then tested it with a sharp tug. It held. It was a small victory in a life where victories were usually measured in survival rather than triumph. He straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, despite the cold that nipped at his exposed skin. He looked up at the sky. Above the jagged line of the mountains, clouds were piling up, heavy and bruised with purple and slate gray. They looked like a chaotic anvil ready to drop. The air smelled of sagebrush and the metallic tang of snow, though the ground was still dry and cracking from a summer that had lingered too long and burned too hot. Eli turned his gaze toward the small ranch house that sat alone on the rise, a few hundred yards away. It was weather-beaten, the wood silvered by sun and wind. Standing stubborn against the vast emptiness surrounding it, smoke curled from the chimney, snatched away instantly by the gale. Above the house, on a steeper slope that caught the first light of dawn, 2 wooden crosses stood inside a small enclosure of stones. He did not look at them directly. He rarely did anymore. The memory of what lay beneath that earth, his wife, Sarah, and the son who had never taken a breath, was not something he needed to see to feel. It was a weight he carried in his chest, heavy as a stone in a riverbed, constant and unmoving. He gathered his tools, the metal clinking softly in the vast silence of the prairie. It was time to get the stock in. The horses in the corral were already crowding the fence, their ears pinned back, nostrils flaring as they scented the change in the weather. The cattle, scattered across the lower pasture, were lowing, a mournful sound that carried for miles. By the time Eli reached the barn, the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. He worked methodically, his hands moving through the familiar rituals of evening chores. He pitched hay, broke the thin skiff of ice that had already formed on the water trough, and checked the latches on the stall doors. The barn was a reprieve, smelling of sweet hay and warm animal bodies. But the wind rattled the loose boards, whistling through the cracks like a thief trying to find a way in. Inside the house, the silence was different. It was the silence of absence. Eli hung his coat on the peg and washed his hands at the basin, the water shockingly cold. He lit the kerosene lamp on the table, the flame sputtering before catching and casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. Supper was a solitary affair, a plate of beans, a heel of stale bread, and coffee black enough to stand a spoon in. He sat at the rough-hewn table, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the mantel and the rising wail of the wind outside. He ate without tasting, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window pane. The glass rattled in its frame. It was going to be a bad one. He could feel it in the ache of his shoulders and the restless quiet of the house. He was alone, as he had been for 2 years, with nothing but the wind to talk to. Miles away, across the open scar of the prairie, a small freight wagon rattled and bounced over the rutted track that passed for a road. The canvas cover snapped violently in the wind, sounding like repeated pistol shots. Lila Moore sat on the hard wooden bench, gripping the edge of the seat until her knuckles were white. She was a woman in her mid-20s, though her eyes held a weariness that belonged to someone much older. She wore a traveling dress of dark blue wool, dusty and travel-stained, and a bonnet that she kept pulled forward to hide her face. Beside her, the driver, a thick-set man with a beard like steel wool, shouted at the team of mules. "Get up there! Keep moving!" He cracked the whip, not touching the animals but startling them forward against the buffeting wind. He glanced sideways at Lila, his eyes narrowing against the grit. "You are awful quiet." "Miss," he shouted over the roar of the wheels, "we still have a good 4 hours to the way station. If this snow holds off—" Lila did not look at him. She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon behind them, scanning the empty line where the earth met the sky. There was nothing there but brown grass and distance. Yet she watched it as if expecting a rider to materialize from the dust. "I am fine," she said, her voice tight. "Just tired." She clutched a carpetbag on her lap, hugging it to her stomach. Inside, wrapped in a soft flannel cloth, was a heavy revolver. Beneath that was a photograph torn in half, and a small stack of currency she had sewn into the lining. Her arms ached, the bruises there fading to a sickly yellow-green, but still tender to the touch. The driver spat a stream of tobacco juice over the side of the wagon. "Well, do not you worry," he said. "Once we get past the ridge, we are in Amos Kincaid territory. He keeps the road pretty clear of road agents. A hard man, Kincaid, but he keeps order, and the Reverend Hale is preaching a revival in town next week. Maybe you can catch some salvation before you move on." Lila flinched. The names hit her like physical blows. Amos Kincaid, Reverend Hale? She felt a cold sweat break out on her skin beneath the wool dress. She pulled the carpetbag tighter, her fingers digging into the fabric. "I do not have need of salvation," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Just passage." The driver laughed. A harsh, barking sound. "Everyone needs salvation out here. Miss, the land does not care if you are a saint or a sinner. It kills you just the same." As if the land had heard him and taken offense, the wind suddenly died. For a heartbeat, the prairie was terrifyingly silent. Then, the sky fell. It did not start as a gentle snow. It slammed into them, a white wall of fury that erased the world in seconds. The temperature plummeted, freezing the breath in their lungs. The wind returned with a scream, driving ice crystals sideways like needles. The mules panicked. They reared, screaming in terror as the whiteout blinded them. The wagon lurched violently to the left. "Hold on!" the driver roared, standing up to haul on the reins. Whoa! But the wheels had lost their purchase on the frozen earth. The wagon skidded sideways, the rear sliding out toward the edge of a shallow ravine hidden by the sagebrush. Lila screamed, but the sound was torn from her throat by the wind. The wagon tipped. The world spun in a sickening arc of wood and canvas. Lila was thrown clear, her body tumbling through the air before striking the hard, frozen ground. Her head snapped back against a rock, and the white world went black. Eli was halfway to the house when he heard it. It was a sound that did not belong to the storm, the high, shrill shriek of a horse in mortal panic, followed by the sickening crunch of wood splintering. He froze, turning his head into the wind, listening. The snow was falling heavy now, a curtain of white that limited visibility to a few feet. Most men would have gone inside. Most men would have bolted the door and stoked the fire, telling themselves it was just the wind playing tricks. Eli Carter was not most men. He cursed, a sharp, violent word, and turned back toward the barn. He saddled his mare, a big roan named Bess, who had steady feet and a calm heart, with practiced speed. He threw a coil of rope over the horn and grabbed his heavy sheepskin coat, pulling it on over his canvas one. He checked his rifle scabbard, then swung up into the saddle. "Let us go, old girl," he muttered, pressing his knees into the horse sides. They rode out into the teeth of the gale. The snow was blinding, stinging his eyes and matting in the horse mane. Eli let the reins stay loose, trusting the mare to find her footing where he could not see. He guided her by ear, pushing toward the ravine that cut through the north pasture. The direction the sound had come from, the cold was a physical weight. It pressed against his chest, seeking any gap in his clothing. He rode for what felt like an hour, though it might have been only 20 minutes. The landscape was erased. There was no sky, no ground, only the swirling vortex of white. Then he saw it, a dark shape looming out of the snow. The wagon lay on its side at the bottom of the wash, one wheel spinning slowly in the wind. The mules were a tangled mess of harness and panic, kicking feebly. Eli slid from the saddle, fighting his way down the slope, the snow already drifting up to his calves. He reached the driver first. The man was thrown clear of the seat, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were open, staring up at the storm that had killed him, already frosted with ice. Eli crouched for a second, feeling for a pulse he knew he would not find. He closed the man eyelids with a gloved thumb. "Is anyone there?" Eli shouted, his voice swallowed instantly by the wind. He circled the wreck. A carpetbag lay burst open in the sagebrush, clothes scattered like colorful flags of surrender. Then he saw a patch of blue wool half buried in a drift. Eli scrambled over the frozen ground. He fell to his knees beside her, brushing the snow from her face. She was pale, deathly pale, her lips turning a faint blue. A gash on her forehead was bleeding sluggishly, the blood freezing before it could run down her cheek. "Miss, can you hear me?" He shook her shoulder. She did not stir. He pulled his glove off with his teeth and pressed his warm hand against her neck. A pulse, faint, threading. But there, she was small, frail-looking in the oversized landscape. He knew he could not wait. The cold was already claiming her. If he did not get her warm, she would be dead within the hour. Eli worked with frantic efficiency. He gathered her into his arms, surprised by how light she felt. She was limp, her head lolling against his shoulder. He struggled back up the slope, his boots slipping on the slick grass. The wind tried to push him back, but he lowered his head and drove forward. Getting her onto the horse was a battle. Bess skittered sideways, nervous at the smell of blood and the storm. Eli spoke to the mare in a low, steady stream of nonsense, calming her while he hoisted the unconscious woman up. He swung up behind her, wrapping his heavy coat around them both, pulling her back against his chest to share his warmth. "We are going home. Bess!" he yelled near the horse ear. "Home!" The ride back was a nightmare. Eli could see nothing. He had to rely on the shape of the land beneath the hooves, the subtle rise and fall of the prairie he had known all his life. He felt the woman shivering against him, violent tremors that shook her whole frame. "Hang on," he muttered into her frozen hair. "You just hang on." He cursed the sky. He cursed the wind that tore at his hat. He cursed the fear that rose in his throat, the familiar, choking fear of holding a life in his hands and feeling it slip away. He had felt this before, holding Sarah as the fever burned her up. He would not let it happen again. Not this time. When the dark outline of the ranch house finally emerged from the whiteout, Eli nearly wept with relief. He rode the horse right up to the porch steps, sliding off with legs that felt like wood. He pulled Lila down, her body stiff and unyielding, and kicked the front door open. The wind slammed the door shut behind them, cutting off the scream of the storm. The sudden silence of the house was deafening. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals, but the room was still warmer than the hell outside. Eli carried her to the rug in front of the hearth. He laid her down, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stripped off his gloves and built up the fire, his hands shaking so badly he dropped the first piece of wood. When the flames caught and roared to life, he turned back to her. She was soaking wet. The snow on her dress was melting, soaking into the fabric and chilling her further. He knew what he had to do. It was practical. It was necessary. It was survival. But for a moment, he hesitated. He was a man who had lived alone for 2 years. The sanctity of a woman's person was something he had been raised to respect above all else. To touch her, to undress her, felt like a violation. She let out a soft, whimpering sound, her teeth chattering. "Forgive me, miss," he whispered. He went to work. He unbuttoned the high collar of her dress. His rough, calloused fingers clumsy with the small fastenings. He peeled the wet wool from her shoulders, sliding the sleeves down her arms. He tried not to look at the pale skin revealed, the curve of her shoulder, the hollow of her throat. He kept his eyes fixed on his task, staring at the buttons, the fabric, the wall, anything but her. He stripped her down to her chemise and drawers, which were damp but not soaked. He grabbed the quilt from his own bed and wrapped her in it, tucking the edges under her shivering body. He checked her head. The cut was nasty but had stopped bleeding. He ran his hands over her arms and legs, checking for breaks. His fingers brushed her bare shin where the stocking had torn. Her skin was like ice. He moved his hand to her ribs, pressing gently. She flinched in her unconscious state, a gasp escaping her lips. "Easy," he muttered, his jaw tight. "I am just making sure nothing is busted." He pulled his hand away quickly, the heat of the contact lingering on his fingertips. He felt a flush rise up his neck, a mix of embarrassment and a sudden, sharp awareness of her proximity. He stood up abruptly, turning his back to her to grab the kettle. He filled it with water and set it on the stove. The mundane action grounded him. He was just a man helping a neighbor. That was all. The night was long. The storm raged outside, burying the world. But inside the small circle of lamplight, a different struggle played out. Lila's breathing was shallow and ragged. Every hour, Eli woke her enough to sip warm water laced with a little whiskey. She drank blindly, her eyes opening but seeing nothing, delirious with cold. He sat in the rocking chair, watching her. He rubbed her hands between his own, trying to transfer his life into her. Her hands were small, the fingers long and elegant, but the palms were calloused. She was a worker. He liked that. His mind drifted. He looked at the shadows on the wall and saw Sarah. He saw the way she used to braid her hair by the fire. He saw the way she smiled when he came in from the cold. The grief, usually a dull ache, sharpened into a fresh stab of pain. "Why did you bring her here?" The voice in his head whispered. "You know how this ends. Everyone you love leaves. Everyone you try to save dies. I did not have a choice," he answered himself silently. "I could not leave her in the snow." Toward morning, the wind finally died. The silence that followed was absolute. Eli had dozed off in the chair, his chin on his chest. He woke with a start, the morning light streaming through the frosted window pane. It was a harsh, brilliant light, reflecting off the miles of new snow outside. He looked at the floor. Lila was sleeping. Her breathing he had evened out, deep and rhythmic. The flush of fever was gone, replaced by a natural, though pale, color. Eli leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and looked at her. Really looked at her. She was beautiful, even with her hair matted and her face bruised. There was a fineness to her features that the rough country usually eroded, but there was something else, too, even in sleep. Her brow was furrowed, her hands clenched in the quilt. She looked wary. She looked like someone who expected to be hurt. He saw the bruises on her upper arms, revealed where the quilt had slipped. They were shaped like fingers. Eli felt a coldness in his gut that had nothing to do with the winter. He had brought a stranger into his home, a woman with bruises, a gun in her bag, and a fear of names he knew well. Amos Kincaid, Reverend Hale. He stood up and walked to the window. The world outside was buried. The drifts were piled halfway up the fence posts. The mountains were blinding white against a blue sky. It was beautiful and deadly. He knew, with the certainty of a man who watched the weather for a living, that the storm had passed. But the trouble was just beginning. He could not send her away. The road would be impassable for days, maybe weeks. And even if it were clear, looking at the bruises on her arms, he knew he could not put her back on a wagon to face whatever she was running from. He was stuck, and looking back at the woman sleeping on his floor, he felt a flicker of something dangerous, a desire to protect her that terrified him more than the blizzard ever could. Eli Carter sighed. The sound, loud in the quiet house. He turned away from the window and went to put more wood on the fire. The smell of coffee was the first thing to reach her. It was strong, bitter, and hot, cutting through the haze of a headache that throbbed behind her eyes like a hammer striking an anvil. Lila Moore opened her eyes. The light was gray and diffused, filtering through a frosted window pane that rattled in its frame. She was lying on a rug, close to a cast-iron stove that radiated a fierce, dry heat. Above her, rough-hewn log beams crossed a ceiling darkened by years of smoke. Memory returned in jagged shards. The wagon, the screaming wind, the driver neck twisted wrong. The cold, that terrible, bone-snapping cold. She shifted, intending to sit up, and the heavy quilt slipped from her shoulder. The air hit her skin, and she froze. She looked down. Her blue wool traveling dress was gone. Her corset, her petticoats, her boots, all gone. She was wearing only her thin chemise and drawers, and even those felt different, dry and warm, as if they had been dried by the fire while she slept. Panic, sharp and immediate, seized her chest. She scrambled backward, yanking the quilt up to her chin, her back hitting the legs of a heavy wooden chair. "Who is there?" she cried out, her voice cracking. A figure moved in the corner of the room. A man. He had been standing so still she had taken him for a shadow. He turned slowly, holding a tin cup in one hand. He was tall, with shoulders that filled his flannel shirt, and a face that looked like it had been carved from oak, hard planes, deep lines, and eyes the color of slate. Lila pressed herself against the chair legs, her eyes darting around the room for a weapon. "Where are my clothes? What did you do?" Eli Carter stopped 5 feet away. He did not come closer. He held the cup out slightly, as if offering a peace offering to a cornered wildcat. "They are drying," he said. His voice was deep, rusted from disuse. On the chair by the door, Lila glanced quickly at the door. Her dress was draped there, stiff and wrinkled. But there, she looked back at him, her breathing shallow and fast. "Why am I not wearing them?" Eli looked at her. Then his gaze dropped to the floor. A flush of color, dark and unmistakable, crept up his neck and burned the tips of his ears. He turned his body slightly away, staring resolutely at the chinking between the logs on the far wall. "You were freezing." "Miss," he said, the words coming out flat and blunt, "you were wet through and the hypothermia had set in. If I had left you in those wet woolens, you would be dead right now. I did what was necessary." Lila gripped the quilt tighter. Her mind raced, calculating the distance to the door, the likelihood of outrunning a man this size in the snow. "You touched me. I checked for broken bones," Eli said. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "And I got you warm. That is all." He set the tin cup down on the table within her reach, then took a distinct step back. "There is coffee. Drink it. I have to go out." He grabbed a heavy sheepskin coat from a peg, jammed a hat onto his head, and walked out the door without looking at her again. The latch clicked shut, and Lila was alone. She stayed frozen for a long moment, listening to the crunch of his boots fading in the snow. Then, slowly, she let her shoulders drop. She tested her limbs. Her head ached, and she was stiff as a board, but there was no other pain, no soreness where there shouldn't be. She felt safe. She reached for the coffee. Her hands shook as she lifted the cup, the heat seeping into her cold fingers. She took a sip. It was strong enough to peel paint, but it was the best thing she had ever tasted. Lila dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with the buttons of her dress. It was still damp in the thickest folds, but she didn't care. Being clothed was armor. She pulled on her boots, then went to the window. The world outside was unrecognizable. The storm had buried the prairie under 3 feet of white. Drifts curled like frozen waves against the side of the barn, some of them taller than the fence posts. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue, stripped clean by the wind, but the light that bounced off the snow was blinding. She saw the man, Eli, down by the corral. He was wading through snow that reached his thighs. Breaking a path for a few miserable-looking cows, he moved with a grim determination, shouting something at the animals that the wind snatched away. He was alone. There were no ranch hands, no cook, just him and the white silence. Lila turned back to the room. Now that the panic had subsided, she looked at her prison, or her sanctuary, with a critical eye. It was a bachelor's house, clean but sparse. A table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, a narrow bed in the corner that he must have given up for her. But there were ghosts here. She saw them in the small details. On a rocking chair in the corner lay a shawl, woven of soft gray wool. It was faded, the fringe unraveling slightly, but it was folded with a reverence that made her hesitate to touch it. Tucked into the shadows behind the rocker was a cradle. It was rough-carved, likely pine, with rockers that looked uneven. It was empty, holding nothing but dust. Lila walked to the small shelf above the table. There was a Bible there, the leather cover worn smooth by handling. She opened it. A pressed flower, brittle and brown, marked a page in the book of Psalms. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want." She closed the book gently. She walked to the pantry, just open shelves near the stove, tins of beans, a sack of flour, a jar of molasses, salt pork wrapped in cloth. It was the larder of a man who ate to fuel his body, not to enjoy his life. She thought of the men she had known in the towns, men who shouted for service, who threw money on the bar and expected the world to bend to their appetites. This man, this Eli Carter, seemed made of different stuff. He was enduring. He was surviving in a place that wanted to kill him, and he was doing it with a quiet dignity that unsettled her. She found her carpetbag near the door. It had been dried, too. She checked the contents quickly. The money was there. The photograph was there. The revolver was there, clean and dry. She wrapped the gun back in its cloth and shoved it deep into the bag. The door opened with a blast of cold air. Eli stomped in, bringing the smell of winter and wet animal hair with him. He looked exhausted. His face was gray with cold, his mustache frosted with ice. He stopped when he saw her standing there, fully dressed, holding her bag. His eyes went to the bag, then to her face. "The road is gone," he said. Lila nodded, her throat tight. "I saw. It will be a week before a wagon can pass. Maybe 2, if the freeze holds. I cannot take you to town, and you cannot walk it." "I am not asking you to take me," she said, lifting her chin slightly. "I can pay for my keep." Eli frowned, peeling off his heavy gloves. "I do not want your money, miss, but I cannot let you leave. You would freeze before you made the first ridge." He walked to the stove and held his hands over the heat, rubbing them together. The sound of dry skin on dry skin was loud in the quiet room. "I have lost 20 head, he said, more to the stove than to her, maybe more. The wind drove them into the deep drifts in the south ravine. I have to go dig them out." He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable. "There is food in the pantry. You eat what you need. I will be back when I can." He turned to go back out into the killing cold. "Wait," Lila said. He stopped, hand on the latch. "I can cook, and I can tend a fire. If I am staying, I am working. I do not take charity." Eli looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. Then he gave a single, sharp nod. "Suit yourself." He left. Lila did not sit down. She tied her hair back with a strip of ribbon from her bag. She found an apron hanging on a nail, too large for her, smelling of sawdust, and tied it around her waist. She went to work. When Eli returned 4 hours later, the sun was dipping low, painting the snow in shades of violet and blood orange. He stumbled through the door, his movements slow and heavy. He looked like a man who had nothing left to give, but the house was warm. The lamp was lit, and the smell that greeted him was not just beans and stale bread. It was something rich, biscuits baking, bacon frying, coffee fresh and hot. Lila was at the stove, turning the bacon with a fork. She looked up as he entered. "Sit down," she said. "It is almost ready." Eli stared at her. He blinked, as if unsure she was real. Then he hung up his coat and sat heavily at the table. She placed a plate in front of him. Biscuits, golden brown, bacon, crisp but not burnt, beans that she had seasoned with molasses and a pinch of dried mustard she had found in a tin. Eli ate like a starving man. He did not speak until the plate was clean. Then he pushed it back and looked at her. She was sitting opposite him, nursing a cup of coffee, watching him with guarded eyes. "Thank you," he said. "That was good." "I am not useless," Lila said, her voice defensive. "I never said you were." He leaned back, the chair creaking. The heat of the room and the food in his belly were making his eyelids heavy. "Where did you learn to cook like that?" Lila stiffened. She took a sip of coffee. Hiding her mouth. "I worked as a seamstress," she said, "in a boarding house. The cook taught me a few things." "A seamstress?" "Yes." Eli looked at her hands. They were resting on the table. The fingers were long, the nails clean but short. There were no pricks from needles on her fingertips, but there were calluses on her palms, and a toughness to the skin that came from scrubbing floors and hauling water, not sewing fine lace. He looked at her face. He saw the way she held her jaw, tight and ready for an argument. He heard the faint edge in her voice, a sharpness that didn't belong to a seamstress. She spoke like the women he had heard in the saloons in Cheyenne, women who had to be sharp to cut through the noise of men. "You must have been a good seamstress," he said quietly. "To afford a private wagon?" Lila flinched. It was a small movement, a tightening of the eyes. But he caught it. "I saved," she said quickly. "I saved for 3 years. I wanted to go to California, to start fresh. California is a long way from here. I know how to read a map." "Mr. Carter." Eli held up a hand. "I am not interrogating you." "Miss..." Lila stood up abruptly. "Gathering the plates." The clatter of tin was loud. "It feels like you are..." She walked to the basin and started washing the dishes with aggressive scrubbing motions. Eli watched her back. He knew she was lying. He knew it as surely as he knew the wind was going to pick up again tonight. A seamstress didn't carry a revolver in her bag. A seamstress didn't have eyes that constantly checked the door. But he also knew what it looked like when someone was running from something they couldn't fight. He had seen that look in the mirror enough times. He stood up and walked to the ladder that led to the loft. "I will take the loft," he said. "You take the bed." Lila turned, soap suds dripping from her hands. "No, I will take the loft. It is your house. I am heavier," Eli said, "and the ladder is steep. If you fall in the night, I do not want to be the one to dig a grave in this frost. You take the bed." He did not wait for an argument. He climbed the ladder, the wood groaning under his weight, and disappeared into the shadows above. Over the next 3 days, the world remained frozen. The wind scoured the snow into drifts that looked like frozen waves, and the temperature hovered near zero. An uneasy rhythm developed between them. They were two strangers trapped in a wooden box, circling each other like wary dogs. Lila took over the house. She scrubbed the floor, dusted the shelves, and mended the tear in Eli's spare coat. She cooked meals that made the meager supplies taste like a feast. Eli spent his days outside. He dug cattle out of drifts, moved hay, and chopped wood until his arms burned. He came in only to eat and sleep, but the house was small. They could not avoid each other. There were moments, small, terrifying moments of intimacy. One evening, Eli was drying a plate she had washed. He reached for it, and his fingers brushed hers. The contact was electric. They both pulled back as if burned. Lila turned away quickly to wipe the table. Eli stared at his hand, then at her back, his heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Another time, he was chopping kindling by the stove. He had rolled up his sleeves. He felt eyes on him and looked up to see Lila watching his forearms, her gaze fixed on the muscles that corded as he swung the hatchet. She looked away instantly, her cheeks flushing pink, but the image of her look stayed with him, and he watched her. He couldn't help it. He watched the way a loose tendril of hair curled against her neck when she was kneading dough. He watched the way she bit her lip when she was concentrating. He watched the way her hips moved beneath the simple calico dress she wore while her wool one was being mended. He felt a hunger that had nothing to do with food. It was a hunger for softness, for a voice that wasn't his own, for the touch of another human being. And it made him feel guilty. He would look at the cradle in the corner and feel a wave of shame so hot it made him sweat. Sarah was gone, but she was everywhere. How could he look at this stranger, this woman with the lying eyes and the bruised arms, and feel this pull? On the fourth evening, the wind picked up again. It howled around the eaves, rattling the window panes. Lila was in the barn, helping Eli fork hay for the horses. She was clumsy with a pitchfork, her small hands struggling with the heavy handle, but she refused to stop. The barn door, which had a loose latch, was caught by a sudden, violent gust. It slammed shut with a crack like a pistol shot. Lila screamed. It was a raw, terrified sound. She spun around, dropping the hay. She gripped the pitchfork with both hands, pointing the tines at the door, her body crouching low. Her face went white, her eyes wide and staring at nothing. "No," she whispered. "No, you do not. You stay back." She was trembling so hard the pitchfork tines vibrated in the air. Eli froze. He saw the terror in her posture. It wasn't just surprise. It was the stance of someone fighting for their life. "Lila," he said softly. She didn't hear him. She was breathing in short, gasping sobs. "I said no. Do not touch me." Eli moved slowly. He kept his hands open, palms showing. "Lila, it is me. Eli." It was the wind. He took a step closer. She swung the pitchfork toward him, a wild, jagged motion. "Stay back. Lila, look at me," he commanded, his voice firm but low. "Look at me." She blinked, her eyes focusing on his face. She saw the concern there, the lack of malice. She looked at the barn door, now still. She looked at the pitchfork in her hands. The tension drained out of her in a rush. She dropped the fork and slumped against the stall door, burying her face in her hands. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I am sorry. I thought—" Eli stepped forward and gently kicked the pitchfork out of reach. He didn't touch her, though every instinct in him screamed to wrap his arms around her shaking shoulders. "Who did you think it was?" "Lila." She shook her head, not looking up. "You said you were a seamstress." Eli said, "I lied. I know." She looked up then. Her eyes were wet, swimming with tears she refused to let fall. "I am not a seamstress. I worked at the Golden Garter in Miles City." Eli went very still. Miles City was a rough town, a cattle town, and the Golden Garter was not a place for sewing. "I danced," she said, the words spilling out now as if a dam had broken. "I danced with men for $1 a song. That is all. Just dancing. But they always want more." She hugged herself, her fingers digging into her arms. There was a man. Amos Kincaid. Eli knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Kincaid owned half the valley to the east. He was rich, powerful, and mean as a rattlesnake. "He wanted to buy me," Lila said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "He offered the owner $500 for me, like I was a prize mare. When I said no, when I spit in his face, he told everyone I was a thief. He told the Reverend Hale that I was a Jezebel, a corrupter of men." She looked at Eli, defying him to judge her. The Reverend stood in the pulpit and named me. He said I was cursed. He said no decent man should look at me. And then— She stopped, swallowing hard. Then a man came to my room. He said if I was already fallen, it did not matter what he did. He slammed the door. Just like that. She pointed to the barn door. He had a knife. I had a gun. Eli felt a cold chill slide down his spine. "You shot him?" "I shot him." She said, "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted him to stop." But he didn't stop. So I shot him again. She looked down at her hands. "Now I am a murderess, and Kincaid has a bounty on me. $500, dead or alive." Silence stretched between them. The only sound was the horses chewing their hay and the wind moaning outside. Eli looked at her. He saw the truth in her face. It wasn't the face of a killer. It was the face of a cornered animal that had bitten the hand trying to strangle it. He should be shocked. He should be appalled. A dance hall girl, a shooter, a woman with a price on her head. But he wasn't. He walked over to a hay bale and sat down, leaning his elbows on his knees. He looked at the floor of the barn. "The winter of '74, he said quietly. "It was a bad one. Worse than this." Lila watched him. confused by the shift. "We ran out of hay in February," Eli continued. "My neighbor, John Grady, he had a bad year. His wife was sick. He had 3 kids. He came to me and asked to buy a calf. Just one. For meat." Eli paused. He clasped his hands together until the knuckles turned white. "I said no. I told him I needed every head to make the mortgage. I told him to go to town, but the town was snowed in." He looked up at Lila. His eyes were dark, haunted holes in his face. The youngest girl died 3 weeks later, starved. They found her curled up in her bed, wrapped in rags. He took a breath that shuddered in his chest. "I had the beef. I had the hay. I could have spared it. But I was afraid. I was afraid of losing my own stake. So I let a child die to save a few dollars." Lila stared at him. She saw the guilt that ate at him, the same way fear ate at her. She walked over to him. Slowly, she sat down on the hay bale beside him, not touching him, but close enough that he could feel her warmth. "You did not kill her." "Eli," she whispered, "the winter killed her." "I let it happen." He said, "It is the same thing." "No," she said firmly, "it is not. You made a hard choice in a hard world, just like me." She reached out and, for the first time, initiated the touch. She placed her hand on his forearm. Her fingers were warm. "We are both marked. Eli." He looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. The judgment he expected to see wasn't there. Instead, he saw understanding. He saw a reflection of his own damage. He didn't pull away. "I will not turn you in." "Lila," he said. "I know." She said, "And Kincaid, if he comes here." "He will come," she said. "He never stops. Then we will be ready." Eli said. He turned his hand over and covered hers. His palm was rough, calloused, swallowing her small fingers. He squeezed gently. "We will be ready." They sat there in the darkening barn, the air smelling of horses and sweet hay, listening to the wind try to tear the world apart. For the first time in years, Eli Carter didn't feel the crushing weight of the silence. And for the first time in her life, Lila Moore didn't feel the need to run. The thaw arrived not as a mercy, but as a messy, chaotic unraveling of the winter silence. It began with the sound of water, a constant, dripping rhythm from the eaves that maddened the ear after months of wind. The great white drifts that had buried the fences slumped into gray, sodden mounds, and the hard-pan earth turned into a sucking, treacherous mud that clung to boots and hooves with the weight of lead. The wind shifted, losing its knife-edge bite and carrying the scent of wet earth and rotting sage. The plains transformed from a blinding white sheet into a patchwork of brown and gray. And finally, on the south-facing slopes, the faintest haze of green appeared. It was the color of hope, but to Eli Carter, it looked like danger. Green grass meant the pass was open. Open passes meant riders. And riders meant that the isolation that had kept the world at bay was ending. Eli stood on the porch, watching the sunrise bleed across the eastern horizon. He held a mug of coffee, the steam rising in the damp air. He heard the door creak open behind him, and the soft tread of boots on the wood. Lila joined him, wrapping her shawl, his wife's shawl, tight around her shoulders against the morning chill. They stood in silence for a long time. The easy quiet between them had been hard-won over the long winter weeks, built on shared meals and the mutual recognition of scars. "The road will be passable by noon," Eli said, not looking at her. "The mud is drying on the ridge." Lila nodded. He could feel her tension without looking. She was a woman who lived with one foot out the door, ready to run. "I should pack," she said, her voice flat. Eli took a sip of coffee, the bitter liquid grounding him. He looked out at the herd, now scattered across the lower pasture. The cows were heavy, their bellies distended. "I am short-handed. Lila." She turned to look at him, surprise flickering in her eyes. "Calving season is starting," Eli continued, keeping his voice steady, though his heart hammered a strange rhythm against his ribs. "I have got 300 head in only 2 hands. I cannot do it alone, not this year." He turned to face her. The morning light caught the sharp angles of her face, softening the wariness that never quite left her eyes. "I am offering you a job. Stay through the calving. Earn your keep. I will pay you fair wages, $30 a month and board. When the calves are branded and the weather settles, if you still want to go, I will take you to the railhead myself. I will make sure you get on a train to wherever you want to go. Somewhere nobody knows your name." Lila studied him. She looked for the trap. She looked for the hidden cost that always came with a man's help. But all she saw was a rancher with dirt under his fingernails and a tiredness around his eyes that mirrored her own. "I do not know anything about birthing calves." "Eli," she said. "She." "You learn to cook in a week," he said. "You will learn this. It is messy work. It is hard work, but it is honest." Lila looked out at the horizon, where the mountains stood like blue ghosts. She thought of the road, the cold uncertainty of running, the fear of every shadow. Then she looked at the ranch, the sturdy barn, the smoke curling from the chimney, the man standing solid as an oak beside her. $30, she said, "and board," Eli added. Lila stuck out her hand. It was small, rough from the winter chores, but steady. "It is a deal. Mr. Carter." Eli took her hand. Her grip was firm. He held it a second longer than necessary, then released it as if it burned. "We start now," he said gruffly. "Number 42 looks like she's ready to drop." The next month was a blur of exhaustion, mud, and fluids. Lila learned that the romance of the West was a lie told by people who had never had to pull a calf from a heaving cow at 3 a.m. with ice forming on their eyelashes. She learned the smell of the calving shed, a thick, heavy scent of blood, afterbirth, steam, and manure. She learned to ignore the gore that coated her arms up to the elbows. She learned to use a block and tackle to hoist a calf that was twisted wrong, listening to Eli's calm, low voice guiding her hands. "Easy now," he would say, his shoulder pressing against hers as they worked in the dim lantern light. "Turn the leg, feel for the joint. There. Now pull, steady." She learned to wrestle calves that weighed nearly as much as she did, holding them down while Eli doctored navels or checked for scours. She mended fences, her fingers raw and bleeding from the barbs, stretching the wire until her muscles screamed. The work was brutal. It left her aching in places she didn't know she had muscles, but it was also a purgation. Every fence post she set felt like a barrier between her and her past. Every calf that stood up, wobbling on wet legs and bawling for its mother, felt like a victory against the death that had shadowed her for so long. The land demanded everything she had, and in giving it, she found a strange kind of peace. She wasn't Lila, the dance hall girl. She wasn't the fallen woman. She was just a pair of hands keeping life going in a harsh world. And Eli was there, always there. He worked harder than she did, taking the worst shifts, the heaviest loads. But he watched her. He watched her wipe sweat from her forehead with a bloody forearm. He watched her coo softly to a rejected calf she was bottle feeding. His respect for her grew like the grass on the south slopes, slow, silent, and deep. But the supplies were running low. The flour barrel was empty, and the coffee was gone. A trip to town was inevitable. They rode out on a Tuesday, the sky a high, hard blue. The mud had dried enough to let the wagon pass, though the ruts were deep enough to swallow a wheel. Eli drove the team, and Lila sat beside him. Dressed in her mended blue wool dress and a bonnet she pulled low over her face. The settlement, a place called Clearwater, was little more than a scars on the prairie. A dusty main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a livery stable, a church with a white steeple that looked too pristine for the dust, and a sprawling saloon called the Drover's Rest, dominating it all. Sitting on a hill that overlooked the town like a feudal lord's castle was the brick house of Amos Kincaid. It was a dark, imposing structure, out of place in the wild, built to intimidate. Lila stiffened as they rolled down the main street. She felt the eyes. Men stopped on the boardwalk to watch them pass. In a town this size, strangers were news, and a woman like Lila was a headline. Eli pulled the wagon up in front of the General Mercantile. "Stay close," he murmured. They entered the store. It smelled of pickle brine, leather, and dry goods. The bell above the door chimed, and the conversation inside died instantly. "Mrs. Hale." The preacher's wife was at the counter. She was a severe woman, wearing black bombazine that rustled like dry leaves. She turned, her eyes landing on Lila. Her gaze swept from Lila's dusty boots to her mended dress, finally resting on her face with a look of curdled disapproval. She leaned toward the shopkeeper, whispering something behind a gloved hand. The shopkeeper glanced at Lila, then looked away quickly, pretending to arrange tins of tobacco. Eli felt the temperature in the room drop. He felt the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on Lila. He saw her shoulders hunch slightly, a defensive reflex he had come to hate. He walked to the counter, placing his list on the wood. "Morning. Silas," he said, his voice loud in the quiet store. "I need these filled, and load 50 pounds of flour." The shopkeeper, Silas, nodded nervously. "Right away, Mr. Carter, and for the lady." Lila stepped forward, keeping her head down. "I just need some thread and a packet of needles." "Mrs." Hale sniffed, a sharp, audible sound of disdain. She gathered her parcels and swept past Lila, pulling her skirts aside as if afraid of contagion. "I did not know we were taking in strays." "Mr. Carter," she said to the air as she passed Eli. "One must be careful. Corruption spreads." Eli's jaw clenched. He wanted to say something. He wanted to tell this pious woman that Lila had more courage in her little finger than the whole congregation had in their souls. But the words stuck in his throat. He was a man who avoided conflict. He was a man who just wanted to buy his flour and go home. He let Mrs. Hale pass without a word. He saw Lila flinch. He saw the color drain from her face. And he hated himself. He hated his own hesitation. He moved a step closer to her, but the moment had passed. The damage was done. "I will load the wagon," he said gruffly. "You finish up here." He escaped the store, feeling like a coward. The wagon was loaded, but Eli needed to settle a bill at the livery. He walked Lila toward the wagon, intending to help her up. But the boardwalk was crowded. The doors of the drover's rest swung open, and the smell of stale beer and tobacco smoke spilled out into the street. A group of men tumbled out, laughing and shoving each other. They were rough men, seasonal hands waiting for the drive to start. One of them, a man with a red face and eyes swimming in whiskey, stopped when he saw Lila standing by the wagon wheel. He blinked, swaying on his feet. "Well, I will be damned," he slurred. He took a step off the boardwalk, ignoring the mud. "Looky here, boys. If it is not Ruby." Lila froze. Her hand went to the wagon wheel, gripping the wood until her knuckles turned white. She didn't look at the man. She stared straight ahead at the mule's ears. The drunk laughed, a wet, ugly sound. He pointed a dirty finger at her. "Amos Kincaid has been tearing up the territory looking for you. Darlin' said his little runaway toy stole something precious." He turned to his friends. "This here is the high stepper from Miles City. The one who thinks she is too good for a working man but spreads her legs for the big money." Lila went rigid. She was white as chalk. She looked like a statue made of salt, ready to crumble in the wind. Eli was there in 2 strides. He didn't think. He didn't calculate. He just moved. He grabbed the drunk by the lapels of his coat and shoved him backward. The man stumbled, his boots slipping in the mud, and he fell hard onto his backside. "Shut your mouth," Eli snarled. The drunk blinked, looking up at Eli with bleary confusion that quickly turned to anger. He scrambled to get up, his hand going to the knife at his belt. "Who the hell are you? You keeping her now? You keeping Kincaid's leavings?" Eli stepped forward, his fists clenched at his sides. He was not a violent man, but the rage that flared in his chest was white-hot. "She is with me," Eli said, his voice low and dangerous. "And if you say her name again, I will put you in the ground." The other men on the boardwalk went quiet. They sized Eli up, the width of his shoulders, the callus on his hands, the look in his eye that said he had nothing left to lose. "Come on, Jeb," one of the men said, grabbing the drunk's arm. "Let it go. It is just a woman." The drunk spat in the mud, glaring at Eli. "You watch your back, sodbuster. Kincaid pays for information." Eli didn't wait. He turned, grabbed Lila by the waist, and swung her up onto the wagon seat. He climbed up beside her, snapped the reins, and the mules lurched forward. They drove out of town without looking back, the laughter of the men fading behind them. They didn't speak for 5 miles. The only sound was the rattle of the wagon and the thud of hooves. The landscape rolled by, empty, vast, and indifferent. Finally, Eli pulled the team to a halt near a stand of cottonwoods. He tied the reins and turned to face her. Lila was staring at her hands, which were folded tightly in her lap. She was shivering, though the sun was warm. "Ruby," Eli said. Lila closed her eyes. "That was my name. In the life. And Kincaid, the man said you were his toy." Lila looked up then. Her eyes were fierce, blazing with a mixture of shame and defiance. "Is that what you think? Eli, you think I was his whore? I'm asking what happened. Lila, I need to know what I'm standing between." Lila took a ragged breath. She looked out at the prairie. "I told you he wanted to buy me. That is true. But it was not just money. In that town, Kincaid owns the law. He owns the preacher. He owns the air you breathe." She turned back to Eli. "I worked at the dance hall. I danced. I served drinks. And yes, I smiled at men I hated because it paid for my supper. But I never sold myself, not once, Kincaid. He decided that because I worked there, I was for sale. He told me he would set me up in a house. He said I could have silk dresses and soft beds. All I had to do was be available when he came calling." She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, as if tasting something foul. "I told him I would rather starve. I told him he was a pig in a silk vest." Eli watched her. He saw the tremble in her chin. "He didn't like that," Lila said quietly. "Men like him do not get told no. So he started the rumors. He told everyone I was loose. He told the other men to teach me a lesson." She looked Eli dead in the eye. "That night, the night I shot that man, he didn't just break in. He had a key. The owner of the hall gave it to him. He said Kincaid had paid for me to be humbled." Eli felt the bile rise in his throat. He had been raised in a world of simple rules. Good women stayed home. Bad women went to saloons. It was a line drawn in the sand of his conscience. But looking at Lila, at the bruises that had taken weeks to fade, at the calluses on her hands from his fences, at the terror that had seized her when the drunk spoke, the line washed away. He wrestled with it. The prejudice was deep, a root that had grown for 30 years, but the reality was sitting beside him. He remembered her holding the calf in the freezing mud. He remembered her making bread in his kitchen. He remembered the way she had looked at the Bible on his shelf. He chose to believe her. Not because it was easy, but because the alternative, that the world was just and she deserved this, was too dark to bear. "I believe you," he said. Lila let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since town. Her shoulders slumped. "You should not," she whispered. "Everyone else thinks I am trash." "I am not everyone else," Eli said. He picked up the reins. "Let us go home." That night, the ranch house felt smaller than usual. The tension from the town trip had followed them inside, filling the corners of the room like smoke. The wind had picked up again, a cold draft leaking through the chinking. Eli had opened a bottle of whiskey, cheap stuff that burned going down. He poured 2 glasses. Lila drank hers in one swallow. She was pacing the room, her energy frantic. The shame of the day was vibrating under her skin. "They always want something," she said, her voice bitter. She wasn't talking to Eli. Not really. She was talking to the ghosts in the room. A smile, a touch, a moment of your time. And if you give them an inch, they take everything you have. She poured another splash of whiskey into her cup. Her hands were shaking. "I'm just a runaway toy. Right, that is all I am to them. Something broken to be played with and tossed aside." "Lila, stop," Eli said gently from the table. She spun around, her eyes bright with unshed tears and anger. Why should I stop? It is the truth. You saw them. Eli, you saw how they looked at me. Mrs. Hale looked at me like I was a disease. And that man, he looked at me like I was meat." She moved toward the fire, seeking warmth. but her foot caught on the edge of the rug. She stumbled, pitching forward. Eli was out of his chair instantly. He caught her before she hit the floor. His hands gripped her waist to steady her, his fingers splaying wide against the thin fabric of her dress. He pulled her upright. They were standing inches apart, the heat from the stove wrapped around them. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air in the room grew sudden and thick. Eli could feel the warmth of her body through her dress. He could smell the scent of her, soap and sage, and the faint, sweet smell of whiskey. His heart began to pound, a heavy, drum-like rhythm. He looked down at her face. Her lips were parted, her eyes wide and dark. The desire hit him like a physical blow. He wanted to pull her closer. He wanted to erase the look of shame from her face with his own. He wanted to prove that not all touches were about taking. His grip on her waist tightened. Just a fraction. Lila's breath hitched. Her eyes searched his, panic flaring in the depths. "Don't move your hand there," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't take advantage." The words hung in the air between them. It was a plea. It was a warning. It was the sum of everything the world had taught her to expect from a man in a quiet room with whiskey and a closed door. Eli froze. He looked at his hands on her waist. He looked at the fear in her eyes. He realized what he was doing. He was standing on the precipice of becoming the very thing she ran from. He could pull her in. She was vulnerable. She was in his house, under his protection. It would be so easy. But it would be theft. Slowly. Deliberately. Eli pulled his hands away. His fingers were shaking. He stepped back, putting 3 feet of floorboards between them. He looked at her, his eyes dark with longing, but also with a fierce, burning shame that he had even hesitated. "I am not him," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "I will not be him." Lila stood there, stunned. She had braced herself. She had tightened her muscles for the struggle, or the submission. She had expected the pressure, the insistence, the justification, but he had stepped back. He had chosen her dignity over his desire. Eli turned away, unable to look at her any longer. He grabbed the whiskey bottle and corked it with a sharp twist. "Go to bed, Lila," he said to the wall. Lila didn't move for a long moment. She stared at his back, the broad shoulders, the tension in his neck. "Good night, Eli," she whispered. She climbed the ladder to the loft. She lay down on the pallet, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Her heart was racing, beating against her ribs like a trapped bird. But it wasn't fear. She pressed her hand to her chest. She replayed the moment. The heat of his hands, the way he had stopped. For the first time in her life, a man had held the power to take what he wanted, and he had chosen restraint. And lying there in the dark, listening to the wind. Lila realized something that terrified her more than Kincaid ever had. She realized that she wanted him to touch her, but she wanted it to be his choice, and hers. Over the next few weeks, the air between them changed. The sharp edges of their defenses began to soften. The closeness became intentional. It wasn't just proximity anymore. It was gravity. When they rode out to check the herd, Eli would help her into the saddle. His hands would linger for a second on her waist, steady and warm, before pulling away. When he passed her a branding iron or a pair of pliers, their fingers would brush, and the contact would send a jolt through them both that was almost painful. He watched her work. She watched him think. One evening, they were repairing the corral fence. The sun was setting, painting the western sky in violent streaks of blood red and gold. The air was cooling rapidly, and in the distance, a pack of coyotes began to sing, a lonely, yipping chorus that echoed off the hills. Lila dropped the hammer she was holding. She bent to pick it up at the same moment Eli did. They bumped shoulders. They straightened up, standing close, too close. Eli looked at her. The dying light caught the stray hairs escaping her bonnet, turning them into a halo of copper fire. Her face was smudged with dirt, her lips dry from the wind. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Lila looked back. She saw the hunger in his eyes, but she also saw the question. He was waiting. He was giving her the power. She didn't step back. Eli raised a hand, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. He brushed a thumb across her cheek, wiping away a smudge of dirt. His skin was rough, calloused from years of labor, but his touch was light as a feather. Lila trembled. She leaned into his hand. Just a fraction. Eli. She breathed. He lowered his head. He moved slowly, hesitantly, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt. Their lips met. It wasn't a movie kiss. It wasn't the sweeping passion of a romance novel. It was gentle. It was hesitant. It was the touching of two people who had forgotten how to be soft. Eli's mustache tickled her skin. His lips were dry and warm. He tasted of coffee and tobacco. Lila's hands came up to rest on his chest, gripping the rough fabric of his coat. They kissed under the vast, indifferent sky. While the coyotes sang and the world turned to shadow, they trembled, both of them, afraid of how much they already needed this, and how much it was going to cost them when the world came crashing back in. Spring arrived on the high plains not as a gentle awakening, but as a breaking of the siege. The mud that had trapped them for weeks finally hardened into ruts of concrete-like earth, and the grass exploded in a sudden, violent green across the slopes. The creek, swollen with meltwater, roared like a living thing, and the cottonwoods along the banks put out sticky, sweet-smelling buds. But the green grass brought more than just relief for the starving cattle. It brought the world back to Eli Carter's doorstep. It started on a Tuesday morning. Eli was in the corral, topping off a young Mustang he had traded for during the winter, when the dogs began to bark, a sharp, aggressive sound that meant strangers. Eli swung down from the horse, his boots hitting the dust with a heavy thud. He walked to the fence, wiping sweat from his eyes. 3 riders were coming up the track. They rode good horses, grain-fed and sleek, and their saddles were too clean for working cowboys. They slowed as they approached the house. Lila was on the porch, churning butter in the cool shade of the overhang. She stopped, her hand freezing on the dasher. The lead rider was a man Eli knew by sight, a foreman for Amos Kincaid named Silas Vane. He was a thin man with a smile that looked like a crack in a dry riverbed. "Morning, Carter," Vane called out, leaning casually on his saddle horn. Eli did not smile. He rested his arms on the top rail of the fence, his body blocking the direct line of sight to the porch. "Vane, what brings you this far north?" "Just checking for strays," Vane said. "The boss is missing a few head of prime stock. Thought maybe they drifted up this way during the storm." "We have not seen any double K brands," Eli said flatly. "My herd is accounted for." Vane's eyes drifted past Eli, focusing intently on the porch. He took his time, letting his gaze crawl over the woman standing there. Lila had gone rigid, her face pale beneath the brim of her bonnet, but she did not run. She stood her ground, though her grip on the churn was white-knuckled. "I heard you had some help up here," Vane said, his voice dropping to a low, suggestive drawl. "Didn't know you were in the market for domestic assistance." The other 2 riders chuckled. It was a sound that made the hair on the back of Eli's neck stand up. "She is working for wages," Eli said, his voice dropping an octave. "Same as you. Now, if you are looking for cattle, check the south draw. If you are looking for trouble, you are standing in it." Vane stared at him for a long moment, measuring the width of Eli's shoulders and the steady, unblinking glare of his eyes. He tipped his hat slowly. "Just being neighborly. Carter, just being neighborly." He wheeled his horse around. The other 2 followed, but as they turned, one of them made a kissing noise toward the porch. Eli took a step forward, his hand instinctively going to the heavy Colt revolver at his hip. But Vane spurred his horse, and they galloped off, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the still air long after they were gone. The encounter changed everything. The isolation that had been their shield was shattered. 2 days later, Eli rode into town to settle his account at the Mercantile. The atmosphere in Clearwater had shifted. It was no longer just the women whispering. The men had gone quiet. 2. When Eli placed his order for wire and nails on the counter, the storekeeper, a man Eli had known for 10 years, Didn't look him in the eye. That will be $12.50, the man said, staring at his ledger. Put it on my tab, Eli said. I will settle up after the fall drive. Can't do that. Eli. Eli frowned. Since when? My credit has been good here for a decade. Since folks started talking, the storekeeper said, finally looking up. His face was a mask of nervous apology. Look, Eli, I don't care what you do out there, but Kincaid, he holds the paper on this building. He sent word. Cash only for the Carter place. Eli felt a heat rise in his chest that had nothing to do with the wood stove in the corner. And what did he say? Exactly. He said men who take in stray cats shouldn't act shocked when they get scratched, the storekeeper muttered. Eli reached into his pocket. He pulled out the small leather pouch that held his emergency funds, money he had been saving for a new bull. He counted out the coins, slamming them onto the counter one by one. $12.50. He grabbed the sack of nails and walked out. He could feel the eyes of the town on his back, heavy and judging. They were writing his eulogy, and he wasn't even dead yet. The final blow came on a Sunday afternoon. A black buggy, polished to a high shine, rattled up the lane to the ranch. It was Reverend Hale. Eli was chopping wood, his shirt damp with sweat. Lila was in the garden, turning the soil for the spring planting. When she saw the buggy, she dropped her hoe and retreated into the house, closing the door with a decisive click. Hale climbed down. He was a soft man, with hands that had never known a callus and a voice that always sounded like he was reading from a pulpit. Good afternoon, Brother Carter, Hale said, brushing dust from his coat. Reverend, Eli said, not stopping his work. The axe bit into the wood with a satisfying crack. I came to speak with you about a matter of some delicacy, Hale said, eyeing the closed door of the house. The spiritual health of this community is my burden. Eli, and I fear there is a rot taking hold on your land. Eli rested the axe head on the chopping block. He leaned on the handle, looking the preacher in the eye. If you mean the woman, say the woman. Hale pursed his lips. Miss Moore, yes, her presence here, unchaperoned. Living in the house of a widower. It is a scandal. Eli, it invites sin, and more importantly, it invites the judgment of good, God-fearing people. She works hard, Eli said. She earns her keep. That is more than I can say for some in your flock. Hale sighed, a sound of practiced patience. There is a home, Eli, in Laramie. The Sisters of Mercy run it. It is a place for women of her background, a place for penitence. I have spoken to Mr. Kincaid, and he's willing to pay for her stagecoach ticket. It would be a fresh start for her, and it would restore your standing in the valley. Eli laughed. It was a dry, humorless bark. A fresh start. You mean a prison? You mean sweeping floors and praying for forgiveness for sins she didn't commit, while Kincaid laughs about running her out of the territory. She is a murderess. Eli, Hale snapped, his mask slipping. She is a woman who frequented dance halls and shot a man in cold blood. She is a Jezebel. And by harboring her, you are making yourself complicit. Eli pulled the axe from the block. He didn't raise it, but the steel caught the sunlight. Get off my land. Reverend? Hale eyes widened. You would turn away a man of God. I see a man, Eli said quietly. I am still looking for the God part. Now get off my land before I forget my raising. Hale scrambled back into his buggy. He whipped the horse, wheeling around so fast the wheels nearly left the ground. You will regret this. Carter, Hale shouted over his shoulder. You are bringing ruin on your own head. Eli watched him go until the buggy was a speck on the horizon. Then he turned to the house. Lila was standing just inside the door. She had heard everything. Her face was set in a hard, brittle expression, the look of someone who had packed her bags 1,000 times in her mind. I am leaving, she said. No, you are not, Eli said, walking past her to the water bucket. Eli, listen to me, she said, her voice rising. He is right, not about the sin, but about the ruin. They will burn you down to get to me. Kincaid will cut your credit. He will scare off your buyers. He will starve you out. I cannot be the weight that sinks you." She grabbed her carpet bag from under the bed. She had never fully unpacked it, and started shoving her few belongings inside. "I will go to Laramie," she said, her hands shaking. "Or further. I will change my name again." Eli slammed the dipper back into the bucket. Water splashed onto the floor. "Stop it," he roared. Lila froze. Eli never shouted. "I am tired. Lila," he said, his voice shaking with a rage he had suppressed for months. "I am tired of Kincaid deciding who eats and who starves. I am tired of Hale deciding who is holy and who is damned. And I am tired of everyone pretending that reputation is the same thing as justice." He walked over to her and took the bag from her hands. He tossed it into the corner. "You are not running. Not this time. Then what do we do?" Lila cried, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "We cannot fight the whole town. Eli, we are just two people. Then we make them look us in the eye." Eli said. He grabbed his coat. "Get your dress. The blue one. The best one you have." "Why?" "Because it is Sunday," Eli said, "and we are going to church." The ride to town was silent. The air was thick with a tension that felt like the build-up to a thunderstorm. Lila sat beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She didn't ask what he planned to do. She simply trusted him, a terrifying surrender she had never allowed herself before. The churchyard was full. Buggies and wagons were lined up, and the townspeople were milling about the steps, dressed in their Sunday best. When Eli's wagon pulled in, the chatter died instantly. It was a physical silence, heavy and suffocating. Eli set the brake. He walked around the wagon and held up his hand for Lila. She hesitated for a heartbeat, looking at the sea of hostile faces. Mrs. Hale, the storekeeper, Silas Vane leaning against a post, picking his teeth. Then she took Eli's hand. He helped her down. He did not let go. He tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow and walked her straight up the center path. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, pulling back their skirts and coats to avoid contact. Eli stopped at the bottom of the steps. Reverend Hale was standing at the top, his Bible clutched to his chest like a shield. "You are not welcome here." "Eli," Hale said, his voice trembling with righteous indignation. "Not with that woman." Eli looked up at him. He looked at Kincaid, who had just stepped out of the church door, a thin, amused smile on his face. He looked at the town that had known him his whole life. "I am not here for your sermon." "Hale," Eli said, his voice carrying clearly over the wind. "I am here to make an announcement." He turned to face the crowd. He felt Lila trembling against his arm. He pulled her slightly closer, a solid wall of support. "There has been a lot of talk," Eli said, "a lot of whispers about this woman and my intentions. I thought I would save you the trouble of guessing." He took a deep breath. The air smelled of dust and fear. "I intend to make Miss Moore my wife." The gasp that went through the crowd was audible. A woman in the front row put a hand to her mouth. Kincaid's smile vanished. Eli looked down at Lila. She was staring at him, her eyes wide with shock. He had not asked her. They had barely kissed. They had never spoken of love, let alone marriage. But as he looked at her, he knew it wasn't a lie. It was the only truth that made sense. "She is a good woman," Eli said to the crowd, his voice hardening. "She has worked my land through the winter. She has saved my stock, and she has done it with more honor than any man who would cast her out to save his own reputation." Kincaid stepped forward. He looked like a vulture in a silk vest. "You are a fool." "Carter," he said smoothly, "you do not know who you are tying yourself to. She is damaged goods." Eli turned his gaze to Kincaid. It was a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. "I know exactly who she is. Amos, she is the woman who said no to you, and that is why you hate her, because she is the one thing in this valley you cannot buy." Kincaid's face went a mottled shade of purple. Hale stepped in. "A marriage to a suspected murderess will not stand in the eyes of this community. Eli, it will not erase her crime. Then it is a good thing I answer to a higher authority than you." "Reverend," Eli said. He turned to Lila. "Ready to go?" She couldn't speak. She just nodded. They walked back to the wagon through a gauntlet of stunned silence. Eli helped her up, climbed in, and snapped the reins. They drove out of town with their heads high, leaving the confusion and the rage in their wake. The drive home was different. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was vibrant, humming with the energy of what had just happened. Lila watched the horse's ears bobbing. She waited until the town was just a smudge of smoke behind them. "Did you mean it?" she asked quietly. Eli didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the road, but his grip on the reins was loose, relaxed. "I never say what I do not mean." "Lila, but—" "You did not ask me. I am asking now," he said. He glanced at her then. His face was open, vulnerable in a way she had never seen. "I am a hard man to live with. Lila, I am quiet. I have got ghosts in my house, and I am about to have a war on my hands, but I will never let anyone hurt you again. Not as long as I have breath." Lila looked at him, this man who had just set fire to his life to keep her warm. "Yes," she whispered. "What was that?" "Yes," she said louder. "I will marry you, Eli Carter, even if you are a fool." Eli smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. "Well, that is good, because I would look mighty stupid if you said no." That night, the ranch house felt different. It was no longer a shelter. It was a fortress. But inside, the air was soft. They ate supper in a comfortable silence. Afterward, Eli added wood to the stove, while Lila tidied the table. The adrenaline of the day was fading, replaced by a deep, humming awareness of each other. Lila stood by the window, looking out at the dark. She turned to find Eli watching her. He was standing by the fireplace, the orange light casting half his face in shadow. She walked over to him. She stopped a foot away. The memory of that night with the whiskey bottle stood between them, the night she had begged him not to touch her. Lila took a step closer. She reached out and took his hand. It was large, rough, scarred from barbed wire and hard work. She lifted it. She placed his hand on her waist, exactly where she had banned it before. His fingers played against the fabric of her dress, warm and heavy. Eli went still. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. "Don't move your hand there," she whispered, echoing the words from months ago. She paused, her breath catching in her throat. She stepped in, pressing her body against his hand, closing the distance. "Move it," she whispered, her voice fierce and trembling. "Move it only as far as you can and still look me in the eye." Eli let out a ragged breath. He looked into her eyes, those wary, beautiful eyes that were finally trusting him. "Lila," he groaned. He moved his hand. He slid it up the curve of her waist, over her ribs, his thumb tracing the line of her spine. He didn't look away. He held her gaze, letting her see the desire, the worship, the restraint. He pulled her against him. Her dress slipped off one shoulder. He bent his head and pressed a kiss to the hollow of her collarbone, a spot that pulsed with her heartbeat. Lila sighed, a sound of pure release. She guided his other hand to her neck, tangling her fingers in his hair. There was no rush. There was no desperate grappling. It was a slow, deliberate exploration. Every touch was a question. Every sigh was an answer. They moved to the bed, the one she had slept in alone for months. He undressed her as if she were made of glass, pausing to kiss the bruises that had long since faded but still lingered in her memory. When they finally came together, the wind was rattling the windows, trying to get in, but it couldn't touch them. They clung to each other, skin against skin, a shield against the world verdict. It wasn't just passion, it was a claiming. He was hers, she was his, and the rest of the world could burn for all they cared. The morning brought reality back with the harsh light of dawn. Eli woke first. He lay for a moment, listening to Lila's steady breathing beside him. He felt a fierce swell of protectiveness that almost choked him. But he also felt the dread. He got up and dressed quietly. He went outside to check the herd. The wind was cold. He walked down to the stream, checking the water levels. That was where he found it. A calf, one of the new ones. A little white-faced heifer was lying in the mud near the crossing. Its throat had been cut. Eli stood over the small carcass. It hadn't been a coyote. The cut was clean, made with a sharp knife, and next to the calf, a section of his fence had been cut. Not just the wire snipped, but the posts dug up and dragged away. The cattle that had been in that pasture were gone, scattered into the hills. Eli stared at the blood on the grass. It was bright red against the green. It was a message. Kincaid wasn't going to sue him. He wasn't going to lecture him. He was going to bleed him dry. Eli walked back to the house, his face set in stone. Lila was awake. She was making coffee, wearing one of his shirts over her chemise. She looked soft, happy. When she saw his face, the smile died. "What is it?" she asked. Eli sat down at the table. He put his head in his hands. They cut the fence, and they killed a calf. Lila went very still. She knew what that meant. It wasn't about the calf. It was a promise of what would happen to them. She walked over to him. She put a hand on his shoulder. "I have to go." "Eli." He looked up, his eyes snapping with sudden fury. "Don't you start that again. I am serious," she said, her voice shaking. "He will not stop. He will kill your stock. He will burn your barn. He might kill you. If I leave, if I disappear, he will lose interest. And go where?" Eli stood up, knocking the chair back. "To a brothel, to a grave. I will survive," she said. "I always survive. Survival is not enough." Eli grabbed her shoulders. He wasn't gentle this time. He was desperate. "I did the unthinkable yesterday. Lila, I stood up in front of God and everyone and claimed you. I put my name next to yours. You do not get to walk away from that. You are a rancher." "Eli," she cried, "you need this land. You need this herd. The West eats men like you alive when they stand up to men like Kincaid. Let him try to eat me." Eli snarled. He pulled her close, burying his face in her neck. He was shaking. "I have lost a wife. I have lost a son. I have buried everything I ever loved on that hill. I am not burying you, and I am not letting you run." Lila held him. She felt the terror in him, the sheer refusal to accept another loss. "Okay," she whispered into his chest. "Okay, I will stay." She looked over his shoulder at the window. The sun was shining on the green grass, but all she could see was the shadow of the brick house on the hill, growing longer and darker with every passing hour. "We stay," she said, "and we fight." The fragile peace at the Carter Ranch lasted exactly 4 days. It shattered on a Thursday morning when the sun was high and brutal, bleaching the color out of the new grass. Eli was in the barn, sharpening a scythe, the rhythmic shh of the stone against steel filling the quiet. Lila was in the garden, knees in the dirt, thinning the rows of early seedlings. The dogs did not bark this time. The rider who approached came slowly, his horse walking with a heavy, plodding gait that suggested a long journey. Eli stepped out of the barn, shielding his eyes. He saw the badge before he saw the face. It was a star of dull tin pinned to a dusty vest. The rider was Marshal Silas Thorne, a man with a reputation that spanned the territory. He was not a hired gun like Vane. He was the law, and he carried it like a heavy stone around his neck. Eli walked to the gate, the scythe still in his hand. Lila stood up in the garden, wiping her hands on her apron, her face going pale. "Marshal," Eli said, nodding once. "Mr. Carter," Thorne replied. He did not smile. He pulled a folded paper from his saddlebag. "I have business here." He looked past Eli to the woman standing among the green shoots. "Lila Moore," he said. Lila took a step forward, her chin trembling but held high. "I am she." Thorne swung down from his saddle. He was a big man, moving with the stiffness of old injuries. He unfolded the paper. "I have a warrant for your arrest, Miss Moore, issued out of Miles City. The charges are murder in the 2nd degree, grand larceny, and abandonment of contract." The words hung in the hot air, heavy and suffocating. "Murder," Eli said, his voice low. "That was self-defense, and the theft is a lie." Thorne looked at Eli with tired eyes. "I do not judge the facts. Mr. Carter, I just execute the writ. The affidavit is signed by Mr. Amos Kincaid and countersigned by Reverend Hale of this parish." Attesting to her character and flight, he reached for the cuffs at his belt. "You will have to come with me, Miss—" Eli stepped between them. "You are not putting chains on her." Thorn's hand hovered near his gun. "Do not make this hard. Eli, I have 2 deputies waiting down at the creek. We are going to town. She goes upright, or she goes slung over a saddle. That is your choice." Lila walked to the gate. She put a hand on Eli's arm. The touch was light, but it stopped him cold. "It is all right." "Eli," she said softly. "It is not all right." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "If you fight him, they will kill you. And then I am truly alone." She turned to the marshal and held out her wrists. Thorn snapped the iron cuffs shut. The sound was a metallic click that echoed like a gunshot. They rode to town in a grim procession. Lila sat on her own horse, her hands bound to the saddle horn, the marshal leading her mount by a lead rope. Eli rode alongside, refusing to fall back, refusing to leave her flank. The landscape seemed to mock them. The dust swirled in choking clouds, kicked up by the horses' hooves. The sun beat down with a malice that felt personal, burning the back of their necks. High above, 3 buzzards circled in a lazy, tightening spiral, waiting for something to die. They reached Clearwater as the sun began to dip. The town was quiet, but curtains twitched in windows as they passed. They led Lila straight to the jailhouse, a small building of stone and iron that smelled of damp earth and stale tobacco. Thorn opened the cell door. Lila stepped inside. She turned to look at Eli one last time before the bars clattered shut. Her face was a mask of terrified composure. "I will get you out," Eli said, gripping the cold iron bars. "I promise you." "Go home. Eli," she whispered. "Please." He did not go home. The jail cell was dark, illuminated only by a sliver of light from the corridor. Lila sat on the narrow cot, pulling her knees to her chest. The smell of the place, unwashed bodies, fear, and damp stone pressed in on her. This was it. The nightmare she had outrun for a year had finally caught her. She closed her eyes and saw the faces. Kincaid, smiling his thin, shark smile. Hale, pointing a finger of judgment. The man in the room, his breath smelling of onions and gin, the weight of him crushing her breath away. The lock to the outer door clicked. Eli walked in. He carried a tin plate of food from the hotel restaurant, steak and potatoes. Not jail slop. He slid it through the slot. "Eat," he said. Lila looked at the food. Her stomach turned. "I cannot." "You have to keep your strength up," Eli said. "The circuit judge arrives on Thursday. That gives us 2 days. Lila stood up and walked to the bars. Her hands, free of the chains now but still aching, wrapped around the metal. "Eli, listen to me. I am listening. You have to let this go." Eli frowned, his brow furrowing in the dim light. "What are you talking about?" "Look at where we are," she said, her voice rising with hysteria. "I am in a cage. The whole town is against me. Kincaid has money, and Hale has God. You cannot win this." "I do not care about the odds," Eli said. "I care about you," she cried. "If you stand with me, they will destroy you. You will lose the ranch. You will lose your name." She pressed her forehead against the cold bars. "Forget me, Eli, please. Sell the ranch. Move west. Find a clean wife. A woman who does not come with warrants and blood on her hands. Find someone who can give you children without the whole town whispering that they are the spawn of a whore." Eli reached through the bars. He took her face in his rough hands, forcing her to look at him. "I do not want a clean wife," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want you, but I am ruined," she sobbed. "You are not ruined," he said fierce. "You are scarred. There is a difference, and I am not going anywhere." He let go of her face and stepped back, buttoning his coat. "I am going to get help." "Where?" "Miles City." "It is a 2-day ride," Lila whispered. "You will never make it back in time." "I will ride fresh horses," Eli said. "I will make it." He turned and walked out. Lila listened to his boots on the floorboards, the sound of her only hope walking away into the night. Eli rode like a man possessed. He swapped horses at the relay station, paying double for the fresh mount without haggling. He slept in the saddle, dozing in 10-minute bursts while the horse kept moving. He reached Miles City at dawn on the second day. It was a sprawling, dirty town, bigger than Clearwater, smelling of coal smoke and money. He went straight to the Golden Garter. It was closed at this hour. The chairs upturned on the tables, the floor sweeping being done by a boy with a broom. Eli pushed past the boy and found the barkeep counting inventory. "I am looking for a woman named Clara," Eli said. The barkeep didn't look up. "Clara, who? She worked here a year ago. Friend of a girl named Ruby." The barkeep stopped counting. He looked Eli up and down. "You a lawman?" "No, I am the man who is going to stop a hanging." The barkeep hesitated, then jerked his thumb toward the back. "She is in the boarding house across the alley. Room 4. Eli found her." Clara was a woman with hair dyed a harsh yellow and eyes that had seen too much of the world. She opened the door in her dressing gown, looking suspicious. "I am looking for Ruby," Eli said. Clara's face softened instantly. "Is she alive?" "She is alive, but she is in jail. They are trying her for murder." Clara let him in. She sat on the edge of her unmade bed and listened as Eli told the story. When he finished, she lit a cigarette, her hands shaking slightly. "They said she stole money." Eli said, "Kincaid claims she took $500. She never took a dime." Clara said, blowing smoke at the ceiling. "She ran with the clothes on her back and $10 in tips she had hidden in her shoe, and the man she shot." Clara looked at Eli. Her eyes were hard. His name was Daggert. He was a breaker for the mining company. Big man. Mean. Kincaid gave him the key. "I saw him do it. I saw him hand Daggert the key to Ruby Room and laugh. He said, 'Go break the filly.'" "Will you say that to a judge?" Eli asked. Clara laughed bitterly. "Who is going to believe a dance hall girl over a cattle baron? A man who wants to know the truth," Eli said. Clara looked at him. She saw the desperation in his face, and the love. "It is a long ride," she said. "I have a wagon waiting." Eli said, "We leave now." The trial was held in the saloon of the Drover Rest because the courthouse was being painted and the jail was too small. The irony was lost on no one. The room was packed. It was hot, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, whiskey, and anticipation. Men stood 3 deep at the bar, drinking as if they were at a theater. Women sat on the chairs arranged near the front, whispering behind lace handkerchiefs. Judge Vance sat behind a table that had been scrubbed clean of beer rings. He was a man of 60, with a face like tanned leather and eyes that looked like they had been squinting into the sun for a lifetime. He looked tired. Lila sat at a small table to the left, wearing her mended blue dress. She kept her eyes on her hands. Kincaid sat to the right, looking confident in a suit of gray wool. Reverend Hale sat beside him. The prosecutor, a lawyer on Kincaid payroll, painted a picture of a woman loose in morals and violent in temper. He called Kincaid to the stand. "Mr. Kincaid, tell us about the defendant." Kincaid stood up, smoothing his vest. "I tried to help her," he said, his voice oozing false sincerity. "She was a young woman alone in a rough town. I offered her employment, domestic work. I tried to save her from the life she was leading. But she was wild, ungrateful, and when she left, she took $500 from my safe. And the man she killed?" Kincaid shook his head sadly. "A tragedy. Mr. Daggert was a business associate. He went to her room to retrieve my property. She shot him in cold blood." Lila gripped the edge of the table. Every word was a lie, sharp and cutting. Reverend Hale took the stand next. "She is a danger to the moral fabric of any community," Hale declaimed. "Her very presence incites sin. She tempts men to their ruin, even now. She has ensnared a good man like Eli Carter in her web of deceit." Eli sat in the front row, his hat in his hands. He watched the town nod along. They wanted a witch to burn, and Hale was handing them the matches. The defense was Eli's turn. He did not have a lawyer. He stood up and walked to the front of the room. "State your name." Judge Vance rumbled. "Eli Carter, Mr. Carter. You have harbored the defendant for the winter. Tell us what you know." Eli turned to face the crowd. He looked at Mrs. Hale. He looked at the storekeeper. He looked at the men who had jeered at them. I know that she worked my cattle when the snow was deep enough to kill a horse, Eli said, his voice steady. I know she pulled calves and mended fences and never complained once. I know she saved my ranch. He looked at Lila. They say she is a thief, but she has never taken a penny from me. They say she is a whore, but I have never met a woman with more honor. His voice cracked. Just a little. I love her, Eli said, and I'm going to marry her. Not because she has bewitched me, but because she is the best person I know. A murmur went through the room. It was not agreement, but it was surprise. Is that all? Mr. Carter, Judge Vance asked. No, Eli said. I have a witness. He pointed to the back of the room. The doors swung open. Clara walked in. She was wearing a traveling dress Eli had bought her, dusty from the road. She looked nervous, but she walked with her head high. The room went silent. Kincaid's eyes narrowed. Clara took the stand. She refused the Bible, saying she didn't want to burn it. Tell us about the night of November 12th, Eli said. Clara took a deep breath. She looked straight at Kincaid. I was in the hall. I saw Amos Kincaid give the key to room 3 to Mike Daggert. I heard him say, "Go break her." The crowd gasped. Kincaid stood up. This woman is a liar and a prostitute. She cannot testify. Sit down, Mr. Kincaid, Judge Vance barked. Continue. The judge said to Clara, I heard the screaming. Clara said, I ran to the door. Daggert was on top of her. He was tearing her clothes. He had a knife. He cut her arm. I saw the blood. She pointed at Lila. She begged him to stop. She screamed for help. Nobody came, because Kincaid owns the bouncers. She paused. She shot him. Once. He didn't stop. He laughed. So she shot him again. Clara looked at the judge. If she had not shot him, she would be dead, or wishing she was. The room was deadly silent. The narrative had shifted. The fun of the spectacle was gone, replaced by the ugly reality of violence. Judge Vance looked at Lila. Miss Moore, do you have anything to say? Lila stood up. Her legs were shaking, but she forced them to hold her. I did it, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried in the silence. I worked in the dance hall. I wore the dresses. I danced with the men. She looked at Mrs. Hale. I know what you think of me, but I wanted to live. Is that a crime? To want to live? She turned to Kincaid. I did not steal your money. I stole my life back, and I will not apologize for surviving. She sat down. Judge Vance rubbed his temples. He looked at Kincaid, who was fuming. He looked at Eli, who was standing like a sentinel beside Lila. He picked up his gavel, a heavy wooden mallet. This court finds the testimony regarding the theft to be hearsay and insufficient. Charge dismissed. He paused. Regarding the death of Michael Daggert. It appears to this court that the defendant was under extreme duress. The law allows a person to defend their life. He banged the gavel. Not guilty by reason of self-defense. The room erupted. Kincaid slammed his hand on the table. However, Judge Vance shouted over the noise. Miss Moore, you have caused a great deal of trouble. You are a disruption. If you appear before this court again, for so much as a jaywalking charge, I will lock you up and throw away the key. Do you understand? I understand, Lila whispered. Case closed. Eli grabbed Lila's hand. He pulled her through the crowd, shielding her with his body as Kincaid shouted threats about appeals and corruption. They burst out into the late afternoon sun. It wasn't a triumph. It was an escape. They did not stay in town to celebrate. They rode hard for the ranch, the sense of danger prickling at the back of Eli's neck. The sun went down, turning the sky a bruised purple. The wind picked up, hot and dry, coming from the south. They were 5 miles from the ranch when they smelled it. Smoke. It wasn't the smell of a campfire. It was the smell of disaster. Eli spurred his horse. Lila followed, her heart hammering in her throat. They crested the final ridge and pulled up short. The southern pasture was glowing. A line of fire, bright orange in the dusk, was eating its way through the dry grass. It was moving fast, pushed by the wind, heading straight for the house. Kincaid. Eli spat. He didn't need proof. He knew. They rode down the slope, galloping into the chaos. The heat hit them like a physical wall. The cattle were screaming, running blindly in the smoke. "Get the shovels," Eli shouted. They fought the fire for hours. It was a battle against a dragon. They used shovels to throw dirt on the flames. They soaked blankets in the horse trough and beat at the burning grass until their arms felt like they would fall off. The smoke was blinding. Lila coughed until she retched, her eyes streaming tears that cut tracks through the soot on her face. The fire jumped the creek bed. It was heading for the draw, a narrow ravine filled with dry brush. If it caught there, it would funnel straight to the house. Lila ran toward the draw, dragging a wet blanket. "Lila! No!" Eli screamed. She didn't hear him over the roar of the fire. She scrambled down the bank, beating at the flames that were licking at the sagebrush. The wind shifted. A wall of fire flared up behind her, cutting off her retreat. The draw became a chimney, sucking the heat and flame upward. Lila turned and saw the wall of orange. She froze. There was nowhere to go. "Lila!" Eli appeared at the top of the bank. He didn't hesitate. He jumped, sliding down the loose dirt, right into the inferno. He grabbed her by the waist. He threw the wet blanket over both of their heads. "Run!" he roared. He drove her up the opposite bank, half carrying, half shoving her. The heat was unbearable. Lila felt the hair on her arms singe. They clawed their way up the steep slope, boots slipping on the hot earth. They tumbled over the edge onto the flat ground, rolling away from the lip of the ravine just as the brush below exploded into a tower of flame 50 feet high. They lay there in the dirt, gasping for air, coughing up black phlegm. Eli's arm was burned, the sleeve of his shirt gone. Lila's dress was scorched, but they were alive. The wind died down an hour before dawn. The fire, having consumed the fuel in the draw, burned itself out against the rocky slope of the foothills. The sun rose on a blackened world. Eli and Lila stood on the porch of the ranch house. They were covered in soot, their eyes red-rimmed and hollow. The southern pasture was gone, a vast sheet of black ash. The small outbuilding where Eli kept his tools was a pile of smoldering embers. A good portion of the herd was missing, either dead or scattered to the four winds. But the house stood. The barn stood. Eli put his arm around Lila's shoulders. He winced as the movement pulled at his burned skin. "He won," Lila whispered, looking at the devastation. "He destroyed us." Eli looked at the charred fence posts that looked like broken teeth. He looked at the smoke drifting lazily into the morning sky. "No," he said, his voice raspy with smoke. He took the grass. He took the shed. He turned Lila to face him. He touched her face with a soot-stained hand. "We are still standing. Lila, we are still here." Lila looked at him. She saw the exhaustion in his face, but she also saw the iron. The fire hadn't broken him. It had tempered him. She leaned her head against his chest. She listened to his heart beating, strong and steady beneath the ruined shirt. "We are still here," she repeated. They stood together in the ashy dawn, watching the light creep across the blackened land, ready to begin the work of rebuilding. The worst had happened. The fire had come, and they had survived it. The sun rose on a world that had been stripped of its skin. The lush green of the southern pasture, which had only days ago rippled like a living sea under the wind, was gone. In its place stretched a vast, silent scar of blackened earth. Eli Carter stood on the porch, gripping the rough wood of the railing until a splinter dug into his palm. He did not feel the pain. He felt only the hollow ache in his chest that mirrored the landscape before him. The air was still heavy with the smell of disaster, acrid smoke, scorched earth, and the sickening scent of burnt hair. Above, in the pale, smoke-veiled sky, 3 buzzards circled. They moved in slow, lazy spirals, patient and knowing. They were the only things moving. The cattle were gone, scattered into the badlands or dead in the ravines. The fence posts he had set with his own hands were now just charred stumps, jutting up like broken teeth in a skull. It looked like the end of the world, or at least the end of his world. He heard the door open behind him and the soft scuff of boots. Lila stepped out. She was wearing a dress that was stained with soot and sweat, her face scrubbed raw but still showing the shadow of the smoke. She stood beside him, not touching him, just sharing the view of the ruin. "We lost the hay," Eli said, his voice sounding like dry leaves rasping together. "We lost the south fence, and I reckon we lost half the herd." Lila did not speak immediately. She looked at the blackened ground. "But the house is here," she said quietly. "And the barn." Eli laughed, a short, bitter sound. "A house does not feed cattle, Lila, and a barn does not pay the mortgage. Without the herd, without the grass, we are just watching the clock run out." A rider appeared on the road. It was not a surprise. The vultures were circling, and the biggest one of all had come to pick the bones. Amos Kincaid rode a sorrel gelding that shone like a new copper penny. He was flanked by 2 of his men, but he rode ahead, confident in his power. He stopped at the gate, looking over the devastation with a face that showed no pleasure, but no pity either. It was simply business. He rode up to the porch. He did not dismount. A hard run of luck. "Carter," Kincaid said, adjusting his leather gloves. Eli looked up at him. His eyes were red-rimmed and dangerous. "Luck had nothing to do with it." "Amos." Kincaid ignored the accusation. He looked at the charred earth. "The bank is going to call your note. Eli, you know that. With no stock to sell in the fall, you cannot make the payment. You are finished." "Get to the point," Eli said. Kincaid leaned forward, resting his hands on the saddle horn. "I am a reasonable man. I will make you an offer. I will buy the deed. 10 cents on the acre. It is enough to clear your debt and buy a ticket out of here. You can start fresh. California, maybe, or Oregon. Somewhere the luck is better." Eli's jaw tightened. "And the woman?" Kincaid's eyes flicked to Lila. He smiled, a thin, cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I have a need for domestic help at the big house. Scrubbing floors, laundry, hard work, but it pays a wage if she is willing to learn her place. I will take her on." Lila went rigid. The insult was precise and calculated. He was offering to turn Eli into a drifter and Lila into a servant in the house of the man who had tried to ruin her. Eli stepped off the porch. He walked until he was standing by Kincaid's stirrup. He looked up, and for a moment, Kincaid's hand twitched toward his gun. "Get off my land," Eli said. Kincaid shook his head. "You are letting pride dig your grave." "Carter, I said get off my land, while I still have it." Kincaid straightened. He pulled his horse head around. "You have got a week. Carter, when the bank comes calling, remember I offered you a way out." He rode away, the dust from his horse hooves settling on the fresh burns. That night, the silence in the house was suffocating. Eli sat at the table, staring at a ledger that made no sense anymore. The numbers swam before his eyes. Debts, interest, feed costs. There was no way to make the math work. He stood up and walked out into the dark. The smell of smoke was stronger at night, cooling and settling into the valley floor. He walked up the hill behind the house, his boots crunching on the dry grass that the fire had missed. He stopped at the stone enclosure. The 2 wooden crosses were stark against the starlit sky. Sarah and the boy. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. "Is it me?" he whispered to the stones. "Am I the curse?" He looked down at the darkened ranch house. He thought of Lila inside. He thought of the fire. He thought of the way the town looked at them. Maybe he was just a man who attracted tragedy. Maybe loving him was a death sentence. He heard a step behind him. Lila was standing there, wrapped in her shawl. She looked like a ghost in the moonlight. "You are thinking about taking it," she said. Eli turned to face her. "Taking what? The offer? You are thinking that 10 cents an acre is better than nothing. You are thinking that if you sell, you can save me from starving." Eli looked back at the graves. "I cannot fight the wind. Lila, I cannot fight the fire. And I cannot fight a bank. Maybe he is right. Maybe we are finished." Lila walked closer. She stopped a few feet away. "You mean I am finished? You are thinking you can send me to work for him, or send me away, and you will drift. I'm thinking that I have destroyed everything I touch, Eli said, his voice breaking. Sarah, the boy, the ranch, and now you. If I had sent you away in the winter, you would be safe somewhere. You would not be standing in ashes. Lila looked at him. She saw the guilt that was eating him alive. It was the same guilt that had kept him alone for 2 years. She turned and walked back down the hill. Lila, Eli called. She did not stop. Eli followed her. She went straight to the barn. The air inside was warm, smelling of horses and the faint, lingering scent of the fire. The loft was dark. Lila went to the stall where her horse was kept. She grabbed her saddle from the rail. She was struggling with the weight of it, her movements jerky and angry. What are you doing? Eli asked, stepping into the barn light. I am leaving, she said. She threw the saddle onto the horseback. I am doing it for you, since you are too stubborn to admit that I am the anchor around your neck. Eli grabbed the saddle horn, stopping her from tightening the cinch. Stop it! Let go! Eli! She shoved at his chest. Let go! You want to save me? Fine. I am saving you. Kincaid hates me. Hale hates me. If I am gone, they will leave you alone. You can rebuild. You can find a nice, clean woman from town who does not bring fire down on your head. She was crying now, tears cutting tracks through the soot on her cheeks. I am just a saloon girl. Eli, that is all I will ever be to them. And as long as I am here, you are dirt. Eli grabbed her shoulders. He spun her around and slammed her back against the stall door. Not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to stop her. He was breathing hard, his face inches from hers. You think that is what this is about? You think I care what Hale thinks? Yes, she screamed back. You should. You are a good man. Eli, you belong in the light, and I am dragging you into the dark. Eli stared at her. He saw the terror in her eyes. Not terror of him, but terror of being the thing that destroyed him. She loved him enough to leave. She loved him enough to walk back out into the cold and disappear, just to give him a chance at a normal life. And in that moment, Eli realized the truth. The sin wasn't loving her. The sin wasn't the fire or the debt or the judgment of the town. The sin would be letting her go. The sin would be choosing safety over the only thing that made the struggle worth it. He let go of her shoulders. He took a step back. His hands were shaking. If you leave, he said, his voice low and steady, then Kincaid wins. Lila froze. If you leave, Eli continued, then Hale is right. He said you were a curse. He said you were flighty and immoral. If you run now, you prove him right. You prove that a reputation is worth more than a life. He looked at his hands. I lost Sarah to a fever I could not fight. I lost my son to a winter I could not stop. But this is a choice. He looked up at her. I am not afraid of the fire. Lila, I am not afraid of the bank. I am afraid of waking up in this house alone again. I am afraid of the silence. Lila stared at him. She let out a shuddering breath. But we have nothing. Eli, the land is black. The money is gone. We have the land, Eli said. The grass will grow back. It always does. He reached out and took her hand. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. Rough skin against rough skin. Marry me, he said. Lila blinked. We are engaged. You told the town. No, Eli interrupted. I am not talking about an announcement to shut up the neighbors. I am not talking about a shield. He squeezed her hand. I am asking you to be my wife. For real, in front of a preacher, with a ring. I want to wake up beside you every morning. I want to build this fence again with you holding the wire. I want to fight Kincaid and the bank and the devil himself. But I want to do it with you. He took a breath. I love you, Lila. Not because I saved you, but because you saved me. Lila looked at him. She searched his face for any sign of hesitation, any sign of charity. She found only the raw, terrifying honesty of a man who had staked his life on her. Her defenses, the walls she had built since she was 16 years old, crumbled. Okay, she whispered. Okay. Yes, she said, her voice stronger. Yes, I will marry you. Eli let out a breath that sounded like a sob. He pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. They stood there in the dim barn, surrounded by the smell of smoke and horses, holding on to each other as if the world were trying to spin them apart. They did not wait for the church to be rebuilt. They did not wait for the town to forgive them. 3 days later, a circuit-riding preacher named Thomas, a man with dust on his coat and a Bible that had seen more rain than sun, rode through the valley. Eli flagged him down. They stood on the front porch of the ranch house, the charred pasture stretched out in front of them, a black canvas waiting for paint. Lila wore her blue wool dress, washed and mended, but the scorch marks from the fire were still visible on the hem. She didn't care. She wore them like medals. She had braided wildflowers into her hair, bluebells, and Indian paintbrush that had survived near the creek. Eli wore his Sunday shirt, the one that was tight in the shoulders. He had shaved, his face pale where the beard had been, his jaw set with a quiet determination. The witnesses were 2 ranch hands from the neighboring spread, men who didn't care about politics, only that Eli was a straight shooter who paid his debts. The ceremony was short. Reverend Thomas spoke of fire and renewal, reading from Isaiah about beauty for ashes. "Do you, Eli Carter, take this woman?" "I do," Eli said, and he looked at her, really looked at her, with a gaze that stripped away the past and left only the future. "Do you?" "Lila Moore." "I do," Lila said. Her voice did not tremble. There were no rings. Eli didn't have the money. Instead, he took a piece of leather cord and tied it around her wrist. "I will replace it with gold when the herd comes back," he promised. Lila looked at the leather. It was strong. It was real. "I like this better," she said. They did not kiss like polite society. Eli took her face in his hands and kissed her with a hunger that spoke of near misses and second chances. The ranch hands cheered, tossing their hats in the air. And then, the work began. The honeymoon was sweat and wire. They worked from dawn until the moon was high. They rebuilt the fence, post by post. Eli traded his best saddle for 3 coils of barbed wire. Lila planted a massive garden, intending to sell vegetables to the miners in the hills to bring in cash. They went to the bank together. The banker, a man who feared Kincaid but respected grit, looked at Eli and Lila sitting across from his desk. He looked at their burned hands and their steady eyes. "I cannot give you a new loan," the banker said, "but I will extend the term on the mortgage. 1 year. If you can make a payment by next fall, I will hold the paper." It was a lifeline, thin, fraying, but a lifeline. The town was slower to thaw than the ground. When they rode in for supplies, people still crossed the street. "Mrs. Hale still turned her nose up, but the open hostility was gone. It had been replaced by a grudging curiosity. They had survived the fire. They had stood up to Kincaid. In the West, survival was the only currency that truly mattered. One afternoon, Silas, the storekeeper, slid a bag of peppermint sticks across the counter to Lila for the ride home. He muttered, not making eye contact. Lila paused. "Thank you." "Silas?" It was a small crack in the dam. The real change happened in the quiet moments. It happened when a neighbor, whose cow was sick, rode over to ask Lila for her poultice recipe. It happened when the blacksmith tipped his hat to Eli and asked about the grass. They were not accepted. Exactly. But they were seen. They were no longer the scandal. They were just the Carters, the crazy fools who lived on the burnt ridge and refused to die. Summer deepened. The black earth began to heal. Green shoots pushed up through the ash, fed by the summer thunderstorms. The land was resilient. It did not hold a grudge. On a night in late July, the heat broke. The air was cool and sweet, smelling of sage and damp earth. Eli and Lila took a blanket out to the pasture, past the new fence line. They lay on their backs, watching the Milky Way sprawl across the sky like spilled sugar. The crickets were singing, a deafening, rhythmic pulse. Lila turned on her side, watching Eli profile against the stars. "You are quiet tonight," she said. Eli reached out and found her hand. "I was just thinking." "About what?" "About the winter, about the storm." Lila smiled. "I thought you were going to throw me out that first morning." "I thought about it. Eli admitted. I was terrified. Of me, of feeling something again. Lila moved closer. She rested her head on his shoulder. She took his hand, the hand that had built fences, dug graves, and pulled her from the fire. She guided it to her waist. She moved his hand up, tracing the scars on her ribs, the old marks of a hard life. Then she moved it to the softer places, the places she had once guarded with a pitchfork and a plea. Don't stop, she whispered. Eli turned to her. He loomed over her, blocking out the stars. I have got you, he said. I know. Their lovemaking was not frantic. It was slow. It was a conversation without words. It was Eli thumb tracing the line of her jaw. It was Lila hands mapping the muscles of his back. It was the reclaiming of bodies that had been used, bruised, and judged by the world, now given freely to each other. There was no shame in the dark. There was only the heat of their skin and the cool wind moving the grass. When they lay still afterward, tangled together, Eli kissed her forehead. We made it, he whispered. Lila looked at the stars. She thought of the dance hall. She thought of the jail cell. She thought of the fire. Yes, she said, we made it. The story ends not with a grand victory, but with a quiet morning. October arrived, bringing the gold to the cottonwoods. The grass on the burnt slope was knee-high now, hiding the scars of the fire. Eli and Lila rode the ridge at sunrise. They were checking the herd, smaller now, but healthy. The calves were fat, ready for market. They would make the payment. Just barely, but they would make it. They stopped at the top of the hill. The air was crisp, hinting at the winter to come. Below them, the ranch house stood sturdy and gray, smoke curling from the chimney. To the east, the sun was breaking over the horizon, painting the badlands in violet and rose. Eli looked at the stone enclosure nearby. Wildflowers, fireweed, and goldenrod had grown up around the wooden crosses. The graves didn't look lonely anymore. They looked like part of the land. He looked at Lila. She sat easily in her saddle, her face turned toward the sun. She looked strong. She looked like she belonged here, not as a guest, but as a part of the root system. She caught him watching her. She smiled. What is it? She asked. Eli looked out at the vast, empty prairie. He heard the wind singing through the wire. It used to sound like a threat. Now, it sounded like a promise. I was just thinking, he said. About what? About how much I like the view. Lila laughed. She spurred her horse, galloping ahead along the ridgeline. Her laughter carried back to him on the wind. Eli watched her go for a second, his heart full. Then he spurred his own horse, chasing after her, two figures against the endless sky, riding toward a future they had fought for, bled for, and earned. The West was hard. It was unforgiving, but it was theirs. Thank you for listening to Don't Move Your Hand There. Don't take advantage. Yet, the rancher still did the unthinkable. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Eli and Lila as much as I enjoyed writing it. This story is a testament to the idea that love is not just a feeling, but a choice we make to stand beside someone when the world is burning. I would love to hear from you. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. I am always amazed to see how far these stories travel. If you want to hear more tales of the American frontier, stories of grit, survival, and romance under the western sky, please make sure to subscribe to From Wild West. Share your thoughts in English in the comments. Did Eli do the right thing? Would you have stayed? Let me know. Until next time, keep your fences tight and your powder dry.